Hey there, everyone. A huge welcome back to all our amazing subscribers, and a special shout out to those of you joining us for the first time. You've just landed in the best spot for spine-tingling, sleepless nights. If you're into chilling tales that make you question every creak in your house, you're in the right place. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying lineup, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. Our spooky family is growing, and it's incredible to see how far it reaches. Who knows? We might even have fans tuning in from every corner of the globe soon. Now, before the real chills begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you're always the first to hear the latest horror we've got lined up. Trust me, you won't want to miss the upcoming stories. They'll make you rethink every shadow that flickers in your home. And for the truly fearless among you, hit that notification bell to be part of every premiere as soon as it drops. Ready? Let's get into it. Story 1. The Mysterious Package. The day began just like any other early morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through my quiet apartment, a sanctuary from the bustling world outside. But as I moved through my morning routine, I noticed something out of place. There, on the table with the rest of my mail, was a small, plain brown package. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, but when I looked closer, the lack of a return address immediately stood out. The wrapping was unassuming simple brown paper, tied with twine, and my name was written neatly on the front in a handwriting I hardly recognized. There was nothing about it that should have raised alarms, but a strange sensation crept over me, a chill settling in the back of my mind. Despite the nagging feeling, curiosity got the better of me. With careful fingers, I peeled back the paper and twine, revealing an old, weathered book inside. The leather cover was worn, the edges cracked with age, and the title, once embossed on the front, was barely legible now, obscured by years of dust and grime. I turned it over, looking for any clues about the sender. Nothing. The mystery deepened, but I set the book down on my kitchen table, shrugging off my unease. I had work to do, after all. But as the day went on, my thoughts kept drifting back to the book. Why had it been sent to me? Who would send something so old, so peculiar, with no explanation? By the time I finished my task for the day, the questions gnawing at me were too much to ignore. I had to know more. And more. I sat down at the kitchen table again, my eyes fixed on the book, and carefully opened the cover. A soft, musty smell greeted me as I turned the first few pages, revealing a folded piece of paper tucked between them. My heart thudded in my chest as I unfolded the note. The words, written in the same neat handwriting as my name on the package, were chilling. You don't know me, but I know you. A shiver ran down my spine. The cryptic message left me feeling exposed, vulnerable, as though someone had been watching me, knowing things about my life that no one else should. Who could have sent this? And why? I flipped through the rest of the pages, hoping to find more answers. What I found instead made my stomach drop. Each page was filled with handwritten notes, observations, comments about my life, my daily routine, my work schedule, even details about my recent activities. It was as though someone had been following me, tracking my every move, and compiling a disturbing record of my existence. I read through the notes, my pulse quickening with every page. They weren't just vague comments. They mentioned personal conversations I'd had with friends, places I'd visited, and even mentioned my family members by name. The invasion of my privacy was profound, a violation that made my skin crawl. The more I read, the heavier the book felt in my hands. Each word, each note bore down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. It wasn't just an observation of my life, it was a chilling reminder that someone was out there, someone who knew things about me that no one should. Whoever had written these notes had been watching me closely, documenting every aspect of my existence. The level of detail was terrifying, and the disjointed, sometimes incoherent nature of the notes made them even more disturbing. It felt like I was reading the thoughts of someone obsessed with me, someone who had made it their mission to invade my life in the most intimate, unsettling way. By the time I reached the end of the book, my hands were shaking. The final pages were filled with cryptic, almost frantic scribbles, as though the writer had become more unhinged as they neared the end of their twisted documentation. The last entry was particularly haunting. "I'm closer than you think." I slammed the book shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My apartment, once a place of refuge, now felt oppressive, claustrophobic. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through me. Someone had been watching me, someone was still watching me. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my voice shaky as I explained the situation. Officer Ramirez, who took my report, was polite but skeptical. "We'll look into it," she said, her tone professional but non-committal. But without any identifying information, it's hard to trace the sender. It could be a prank. A prank. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that someone had simply found a way to play an elaborate, cruel joke on me, but deep down, I knew it was something more sinister. After the police left, I took matters into my own hands. I installed additional security measures in my apartment, upgraded my alarm system, and placed motion detectors and cameras in every room. I changed the locks on all my doors and windows, ensuring that no one could gain access to my home without my knowledge. But even with all the precautions, the sense of being watched never faded. Every shadow, every movement outside my apartment felt like a threat. I started varying my daily routine, avoiding predictable patterns, hoping that whoever had been following me would lose interest if they couldn't track my movements. I stopped discussing my plans with friends and family, afraid that someone might be listening. The fear of being watched consumed me, creeping into every corner of my life. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always there, lurking just out of sight. In the weeks that followed, strange things began happening. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving outside my windows, hear unfamiliar noises in the hallway late at night. My paranoia deepened, isolating me from the people I cared about. I stopped inviting friends over, stopped answering my phone, afraid that whoever was watching me might use my connections to get even closer. The book and the note became a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over me. I locked them away in a safe, but the fear they represented never left. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without feeling the weight of their presence in my home. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground for my sanity. Eventually, the police provided an update. They had identified a few leads, but nothing concrete. "Keep your security measures in place," Officer Ramirez advised. "Stay vigilant." Her words did little to comfort me. The investigation might have been moving forward, but my life had come to a standstill. The fear of being watched, of being hunted, consumed me. The book had left an indelible mark on my psyche. No matter how much time passed, I couldn't forget the feeling of being exposed, vulnerable. I tried to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, resuming my social activities, attempting to rebuild my sense of security. But the shadow of the book still loomed large. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone is out there watching, waiting. The experience left me more cautious, more aware of the fragility of privacy. I had always taken my security for granted, but the book and the note were a brutal reminder that someone could invade your life without warning, without mercy. The knowledge that someone had been watching, documenting, and intruding into my life will always remain a haunting memory. Story 2. The Vanishing Possessions. It all started with something small, a necklace I had owned since high school. I distinctly remember the last time I wore it. I took it off, carefully placed it on my dresser, and went about my day. But the next morning, when I went to retrieve it, the necklace was gone. At first, I thought I had simply misplaced it. I searched under the dresser, behind it, inside drawers, and even in places that made no sense, like my kitchen and bathroom. But it had vanished without a trace. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had been careless, or maybe it had fallen into some hidden nook or cranny. Either way, I let it go, assuming it would turn up eventually. But then it happened again. This time, it was a pair of expensive earrings I'd recently purchased. I had placed them inside my jewelry box on my nightstand safe, secure. A week later, they were gone. Just like the necklace, I retraced my steps, checked every possible hiding place, even asked my friends if they had seen them, but no one knew where they could have disappeared to. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I tried to push the worry aside. I told myself that I was just being forgetful, that I must have put them somewhere unusual during a hectic moment. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. My memory was clear, and yet my possessions kept disappearing. When I replaced the missing items, I hoped it was just a streak of bad luck. I bought a new necklace, another pair of earrings, and tried to convince myself that the old ones would eventually reappear. But then, to my dismay, the new items disappeared too. It was becoming a pattern, one that I couldn't explain away anymore, and the frequency of the disappearances started to worry me. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. Little by little, other items around my apartment began to vanish. A book one been reading disappeared from my nightstand. A favorite coffee mug I used every morning was suddenly gone. Even a picture frame with a cherished family photo inside vanished one day, as if it had never existed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just losing things in the clutter of my apartment. Maybe I was being careless, forgetting where I placed things. But the more items that went missing, the more I began to feel like something or someone was deliberately taking them. The situation escalated one evening in a way that shattered all rational explanations. I had left my laptop on the kitchen table while I went to take a shower. When I came back, it was gone. I searched the entire apartment, turning over cushions, moving furniture, and checking every room, but the laptop was nowhere to be found. Now, it wasn't just a matter of misplacing a piece of jewelry. My laptop held important work files, personal information, and irreplaceable memories. Panic set in, and for the first time, I considered the possibility of a break-in. But when I checked the doors and windows, there were no signs of forced entry. The locks were all intact, and nothing else in the apartment appeared disturbed. It was as if someone had taken only what they wanted and left everything else untouched. I felt a growing sense of vulnerability. How could someone be getting into my home? How could they be taking these things without leaving any trace? Determined to catch the intruder, I decided to install security cameras around my apartment. I set them up discreetly, hiding them among everyday objects like picture frames and decorative items, so they wouldn't be obvious. If someone was sneaking in, I wanted to catch them in the act. The first night with the cameras was filled with anticipation. I watched the footage carefully, expecting to see someone creeping around. But to my surprise, the camera showed nothing unusual. No one entered or left the apartment. There were no strange movements. Everything appeared completely normal. And yet, my belongings continued to disappear. One morning, after a particularly restless night, I was making coffee when I noticed that my favorite watch, one I had worn almost every day, was missing. I had left it on the kitchen counter the night before, but now it was gone. Once again, I reviewed the security footage, hoping to see anything that would explain the disappearance. But the video showed nothing. The footage showed me making coffee, setting the watch on the counter, and then leaving the kitchen. After that, there was no sign of anyone else entering the room. The watch simply vanished. I began to think I was losing my mind. How could objects just disappear like that, without a trace, without any evidence of tampering or intrusion? The constant disappearance of my possessions took a toll on me mentally and emotionally. I started double-checking every corner of my apartment, convinced that there was some hidden compartment or secret passage where my belongings were being stashed. I even called a locksmith to inspect the doors and windows, certain there must be some hidden flaw in the security of my home. But the locksmith found nothing out of the ordinary. Over the next few weeks, the disappearances escalated. My camera was the next to go. Then, a set of expensive headphones disappeared, followed by a small box of sentimental trinkets I had kept since childhood. I kept a journal to track the missing items, hoping to find some pattern or clue that would lead me to the culprit. But no pattern emerged except that the items seemed to vanish with increasing frequency. One night, after a particularly unsettling day, I sat down in the living room, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had recently replaced a few more items, and I was anxiously waiting to see if they would disappear too. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound, barely audible, coming from the hallway. My heart raced as I stood up, fear prickling my skin. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the hallway, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. But when I reached the source of the sound, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. No sign of anyone, no trace of movement. I checked the security footage again, but once more, it revealed nothing. No one had entered the apartment. There were no intruders, no mysterious figures lurking in the shadows. Yet the sense of being watched, of being targeted, grew stronger with every passing day. Determined to put an end to the mystery, I set a trap. I placed a few small, inexpensive items in plain sight, things that were easy to notice but not of great value. I wired a small, silent alarm to these items, hoping that if someone did take them, the alarm would alert me. I also kept a close watch on the cameras, monitoring them more frequently. If someone was sneaking in, I was determined to catch them. And then, it happened. One night, while I was lying awake in bed, the alarm went off. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging through my veins, and rushed to the source of the sound. The item I had set the trap with was gone, but what I found instead was far more disturbing. There, behind a loose panel in the wall, was a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment were several of my missing items, jewelry, electronics, sentimental trinkets, all carefully stashed away. It was as if someone had been hiding them there all along, right under my nose. I felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that I had finally discovered the truth, and anger that someone had been infiltrating my life so deeply. But the question remained, who was behind this? I called the police, who investigated the compartment and took the recovered items for fingerprints and further analysis. But despite their efforts, no clear suspects emerged. The case remained unsolved, and the disappearances, though they had ceased, left a lingering sense of unease. Even now, after everything has been returned, I can't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me all along. The experience left me more vigilant, more cautious, always aware that my sense of security had been shattered. My home, once a sanctuary, now feels like a place where invisible threats could lurk at any moment. Story 3. The foul smell. It started on a gloomy Tuesday afternoon. The sky was overcast, shrouded in thick clouds, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. I had just returned home from work, eager to escape the damp, chilly weather. But as I stepped inside my apartment, I was immediately hit by something far worse than the dreary weather outside. A rancid smell clung to the air, sharp and putrid like decaying meat or garbage left out far too long. It was the kind of odor that makes your stomach churn and your eyes water. I froze in the entryway, grimacing as the smell seemed to thicken around me. My first instinct was to check the kitchen. Maybe I had left something out by mistake, or perhaps food had gone bad in the fridge. But after a thorough inspection of the kitchen, I found nothing. The fridge was clean, the trash empty. I even checked under the sink, thinking maybe the plumbing was to blame, but there were no leaks, no signs of decay. Perplexed, I moved to the living room, sniffing the air as I tried to track down the source of the stench. The smell seemed to come and go in waves, stronger in certain areas but vanishing completely when I turned on the lights. It was bizarre, unsettling. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't focus. No matter what I did, the foul odor kept returning, creeping back into the room like some invisible intruder. By the time I went to bed, I had convinced myself that it was just a temporary issue, maybe something in the walls or the pipes, something that would go away on its own. But it didn't. The next day, the smell was back. This time it was even worse, almost overpowering. It filled the apartment as soon as I stepped inside, so thick I could taste it at the back of my throat. The putrid odor seemed to be seeping into everything: my clothes, my furniture, the walls. I couldn't escape it. I searched my apartment again, more thoroughly this time. I pulled the fridge away from the wall, checked every corner, every nook and cranny. I opened the windows to air out the place, but the smell clung stubbornly to the air. It was as though the apartment itself had absorbed the stench, becoming one with the foulness. Hours passed, and I became more desperate to find the source. I moved furniture, checked behind the bookcases, and even crawled under the bed. But no matter where I looked, there was nothing. No mold, no dead animals, nothing that could explain the horrible odor. And then, as mysteriously as it had arrived, the smell vanished. One moment, the air was thick with decay. The next, it was gone, leaving me standing there, bewildered. I had barely started to breathe a sigh of relief when I noticed something else, a strange sense of unease that seemed to fill the silence left behind by the smell. It was as though the apartment was watching me, waiting for something. The rest of the night passed in an uncomfortable haze. The smell didn't return, but the feeling of being watched did. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights felt like some unseen presence was there, observing me. I went to bed, pulling the covers tightly around myself, but sleep didn't come easily. The following day, I woke up groggy and irritable, the memory of the foul smell lingering in my mind. I almost convinced myself that it had been some strange coincidence, that maybe the pipes had cleared themselves out. But when I returned home that evening, the smell was waiting for me. It was worse than before, stronger, sharper, more aggressive. The entire apartment seemed to be saturated with the odor, and I could barely stand to be inside. I opened all the windows, turned on fans, sprayed air fresheners, anything to rid my home of the unbearable stench, but nothing worked. And, desperate, I called the landlord, explaining the situation in as much detail as I could. "It's got to be something with the building," I said, pacing the living room as the smell clawed at my senses. "Maybe there's a dead animal in the walls, or a leak in the pipes. You've got to send someone over to check." The landlord agreed to send a plumber and an exterminator, but they couldn't come until the following week. That meant I was stuck living with this smell for several more days. As I hung up the phone, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a movement, quick and fleeting, near the hallway. My heart jumped, and I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway, dark and silent. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, living in a stench-filled apartment for days was enough to make anyone jumpy. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the smell anymore, it was the creeping sensation that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. The smell would disappear when I had company over, or when I was busy with tasks, only to return with full force when I was alone, vulnerable. It became a game, almost a sick, twisted game that my apartment was playing with me. The smell would hide when I least expected it, lurking in the shadows, only to pounce the moment I let my guard down. The air itself seemed to thicken with it, choking me, filling my lungs with rot. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I sat down in my living room, trying to unwind, but the moment I relaxed, the smell returned, stronger than ever. It was suffocating, invading every inch of my space, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound, barely audible, coming from the kitchen. My heart raced, and I jumped up, grabbing the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and moving cautiously toward the sound. My pulse thundered in my ears as I approached the kitchen, where the smell was the strongest. But when I reached the kitchen, there was nothing. No source for the sound. No explanation for the smell, just the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. The smell followed me into my bedroom, hanging over me like a dark cloud. I kept hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing, no one. No one. By morning, I was a wreck. I couldn't handle it anymore. I called an exterminator, begging him to come sooner. When he arrived later that day, I watched as he methodically searched the apartment, checking for any signs of pests, mold, or leaks. He looked at the insulation, examined the walls, and inspected the ventilation system. But after a thorough investigation, the exterminator shook his head. "I can't find anything," he said, his voice puzzled. "There's no sign of pests or dead animals. The pipes are fine, and the building's ventilation system is in good shape. Whatever's causing that smell, it's not something physical." His words sent a chill through me. If there was nothing physical causing the smell, then what was? The exterminator left, and I was once again alone with the stench. The whispering sounds, the sense of being watched, the smell that clung to every corner of my apartment, it all began to feel like something far beyond a simple plumbing issue. I started to avoid spending time at home, staying out late, crashing at friends' places whenever I could. But no matter how far I tried to distance myself, the smell was always waiting for me when I returned. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the stress of work and life was getting to me. But the smell, it was relentless, suffocating, always lurking just out of sight. And the whispers, they followed me even into my dreams. Finally, after weeks of torment, I decided to take drastic action. I hired a professional cleaning service to deep clean the entire apartment. They scrubbed every surface, sanitized the walls and floors, and even used ozone generators to eliminate any lingering odors. For a few blissful days, the smell was gone. The apartment was clean, fresh. I almost let myself believe that it was over. But late one night as I lay in bed, I caught a faint whiff of it again. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it was unmistakable. And with it came the whispers, soft and insistent, echoing in the darkness. The smell may come and go, but the feeling never leaves. There's something in this apartment, something that won't let me go. The smell was just the beginning. Story 4. The fingerprints. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. One crisp autumn morning, I was preparing my usual cup of coffee when I noticed something odd. As the early sunlight streamed in through the living room windows, I saw them faint, smudged fingerprints on the lower panes. They were small and oddly positioned, not in the pattern I would expect if someone had cleaned or touched the glass from the inside. My first thought was that maybe a neighbor's child had been playing outside and left the prints. Perhaps they had come close to the window to peer in. I wiped them off without a second thought, dismissing the occurrence as harmless. But the next day, they were back. I paused, coffee cup halfway to my mouth, as I spotted the smudges again. This time, they weren't exactly where they had been the day before they had shifted. They were now higher on the glass, as if someone taller had left them. The thought sent a chill creeping up my spine. Again, I cleaned the glass, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe the prints had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. Or perhaps I had accidentally brushed against the window myself, though that didn't seem likely. But the next morning they were there again. And this time they were spread across multiple panes of glass, the smudges fainter in some places but more distinct in others. That unsettling chill returned, more persistent now. I stood there, staring at the fingerprints, a creeping sense of dread washing over me. Was someone watching me? I hadn't heard any noises during the night, and my windows were always locked tight. The neighborhood was quiet, safe. Still, something about the randomness of the fingerprints and their constant reappearance didn't sit right with me. I decided to document the situation. I began keeping track of when and where the fingerprints appeared. I took photos of them, making note of the positions, hoping to make some sense of the oddity. My curiosity quickly turned to paranoia, as I realized that no matter how often I wiped the glass, new prints would always show up the next day. The fingerprints seemed to move across the windows like an eerie game of hide and seek. Some mornings they'd be clustered in the corners, other times they stretched across the center of the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand fully against the pane, watching me through the window. It didn't make any sense. Who would be leaving these prints? And why? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I began checking the locks on the windows multiple times a day, making sure they were securely fastened. I even installed motion sensor lights outside, hoping they might deter any potential intruders. But the prints kept showing up random, disjointed, mocking my efforts to rid my home of their presence. One night, after a long day at work, I collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion overwhelming my growing paranoia. The room was dimly lit, just enough for me to unwind, but as I glanced at the window, I froze. There, in the faint glow of the streetlights outside, I saw it. A handprint. Sure, not a smudge, not a random fingerprint, but a full, distinct handprint, pressed against the glass as though someone had been standing just outside, watching me. I shot up from the couch, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and rushed over to the window, but by the time I reached it, the handprint was gone. My breath caught in my throat. How could that be? I had seen it just seconds ago, clear as day, and now it had disappeared. I felt my blood run cold as I frantically checked the other windows, but there was no sign of anyone, no lingering prints. I hurried to review the footage from the outdoor cameras I had recently installed, hoping they had caught something. But when I played the footage back, there was nothing. No one had approached the house. No shadows moved outside. It was as though the handprint had simply materialized and then vanished into thin air. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound, every creak of the house seemed amplified, my imagination running wild. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me, but the glass remained clear. The next morning, the smudged fingerprints were back, and I could swear they were more numerous than before, as if the unseen visitor had grown bolder. I became obsessed with the fingerprints. I couldn't concentrate at work, my mind always drifting back to the windows and the strange marks. I confided in a few friends about the situation, but they all laughed it off, suggesting it was probably neighborhood kids playing pranks. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt more intentional. One particularly restless night, I was startled awake by a faint tapping sound. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding, as I strained to hear where the noise was coming from. It was rhythmic, soft, but persistent. Tap tap tap. It was coming from the living room window. I threw off the covers and crept out of bed, my footsteps silent on the wooden floor as I approached the window. My pulse was pounding in my ears, a mix of fear and adrenaline surging through me. I didn't dare look at the window directly, afraid of what I might see. Finally, I gathered the courage to pull back the curtain, bracing myself for the worst. But there was nothing there. No figure standing outside, no handprints on the glass. The street outside was empty, the silence of the night broken only by the distant hum of passing cars. Yet the tapping sound had been so real, so deliberate. I checked the camera footage again, desperate for some explanation. But once again, there was nothing. No one had approached the house. No movements, no shadows. It was as though the tapping had been a figment of my imagination, a product of my growing paranoia. But the fingerprints kept coming. Each morning I found new ones in different spots on the glass, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me through the marks they left behind. They weren't always the same shape or size either. Some were larger, others smaller, almost childlike. I was at my wit's end, exhausted from sleepless nights and endless worry. I had checked everything, the windows, the cameras, the locks, and found no rational explanation for the strange occurrences. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the situation escalated. One evening, as I was working late on my laptop, I felt a sudden urge to look up. My eyes drifted to the window, and that's when I saw a faint silhouette pressed against the glass. The outline of a hand slowly forming, as though someone were pushing their palm against the pane from the outside. I jumped from my seat, grabbed a flashlight, and ran to the window, my heart pounding. But by the time I reached it, the silhouette was gone, leaving no trace behind. I frantically searched the yard, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one. No signs of anyone having been there. I felt trapped. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The sense of unease hung over me like a dark cloud, suffocating, relentless. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Then one night, I came home to find something that pushed me over the edge. Written in the dirt on the window pane was a single word, scrawled in shaky, uneven letters. Help. Art. The blood drained from my face as I read the word, my mind spinning with questions. Who had written it? And why? I immediately called the police, but they found no evidence of an intruder, no signs of forced entry. The officer who took my report tried to reassure me, but his words did little to ease the mounting terror that had taken root in my mind. The disappearances stopped after that night, but the memory of the fingerprints, the strange, elusive marks that had haunted my windows for weeks, never faded. Even now, as I look out at the clear glass, I can't help but feel like something is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. The mystery of the fingerprints remains unsolved, a constant reminder that sometimes the most unsettling things are those we cannot explain. Story 5. The Attic Diary. It was a chilly autumn afternoon, the kind that makes you want to curl up inside and avoid the crisp, biting wind outside. But instead of relaxing, I found myself standing in front of the old wooden ladder that led to the attic. I had been putting it off for months, but the clutter up there was growing, and it was time to finally tackle the mess. The attic was a place of forgotten memories. Boxes that hadn't been opened in years, old furniture covered in dust, and long-forgotten family relics. The house had been in my family for generations, passed down through time, and the attic had become a repository for decades of accumulated junk. I pulled the ladder down with a groan and climbed the creaky steps, a flashlight clutched in one hand. The air in the attic was thick with dust, particles floating in the beam of light as I moved forward, carefully avoiding the cobwebs that seemed to stretch from every corner. I began to sift through the boxes, most of them filled with old clothes, children's toys, and yellowed newspapers. The process was slow and tedious, and I was beginning to regret ever starting. But then, something caught my eye. Wedged between a stack of old magazines and a box of my grandmother's costume jewelry was a small, unassuming leather-bound book. It was different from everything else around it, standing out with its delicate brass latch that had rusted slightly over time. The leather cover was worn and cracked, a testament to its age. I hesitated before picking it up, the weight of the book feeling heavier in my hands than it should have. There was something about it, something that sent a shiver down my spine the moment I touched it, but curiosity won out, as it often does. I unlatched the brass clip. The sound of it snapping open echoed unnervingly in the silence of the attic. The first few pages were filled with meticulously neat, old-fashioned handwriting. The ink had faded over time, turning a deep sepia tone, but the words were still legible. The diary belonged to someone named Eleanor Martin. The name didn't immediately register, but I knew it sounded familiar. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that this was no ordinary diary. It wasn't just filled with reflections on the weather or daily events. Eleanor had written about her life with a level of detail that made my skin prickle. What unnerved me the most was how some of the events she described seemed to align eerily with my own experiences. One entry, dated June 5th, 1985, caught my attention. Today was a warm day. Little Sarah fell off her bike and scraped her knee. It's a good thing I was there to help her clean up. My heart skipped a beat as I read those words. I had a younger sister named Sarah, and I remembered a day just like that from my own childhood. She had fallen off her bike, and my mother had helped her clean up the wound. But that couldn't be what Eleanor was writing about. This entry had been written years before I was even born. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the pages as a sense of dread began to settle over me. More entries described events from my family's history, things that Eleanor couldn't possibly have known. Birthdays, anniversaries, even a family gathering where my cousin Michael had thrown a fit over mashed potatoes. All of it was written in excruciating detail. The further I read, the more unnerved I became. This woman had somehow documented moments from my life, moments that she couldn't have been present for, moments that had happened long after she had presumably passed away. It didn't make sense. My mind raced with questions. Who was Eleanor Martin? How could she have known these things about me and my family? And why had her diary been hidden away in the attic all these years? I flipped through more pages, desperate for answers, but what I found only deepened the mystery. The entries grew darker, more fragmented. Eleanor began writing about strange occurrences around her home, objects moving on their own, shadows that seemed to flicker in the corners of her vision, whispers that echoed through empty rooms. One entry sent a chill down my spine. I fear someone is watching me. Every night I hear footsteps outside my window, but when I look, there's no one there. I feel like I'm not alone in this house anymore. The word struck me like a physical blow. I had been having similar experiences in my own home for the past few weeks, small, unsettling things that I had tried to ignore. A glass that had been moved from one side of the table to the other, even though I hadn't touched it. Strange noises in the night that I chalked up to the house settling. But now, reading Eleanor's diary, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The entries became increasingly erratic, her handwriting growing more jagged and uneven as though written in a frenzy. Eleanor wrote about her growing paranoia, about the footsteps outside her window becoming louder, more frequent. She was convinced that someone was watching her, following her every move. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The final entry was dated just a few days before Eleanor's writing abruptly stopped. I can't escape it. Every night, the footsteps come closer. I can feel eyes on me. Even when I'm alone, whoever or whatever it is, it's not going to stop. I don't know how much longer I can take this. That was it. No more entries. No explanation of what had happened to Eleanor. No answers to the questions that were now swirling through my mind. I sat there in the attic, the silence pressing in around me. The house felt suddenly oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. I needed answers. I spent the next few days researching Eleanor Martin. It wasn't easy. There were very few records of her, and what little information I could find was fragmented and incomplete. She had lived in the house during the 1980s and had been known as a reclusive woman, rarely seen by her neighbors. Her name didn't appear in any local newspapers, and there were no death records associated with her. It was as though she had simply disappeared. Desperate for more information, I decided to investigate further. I found out that Eleanor's old house still stood, though it had been abandoned for years. It was located not far from my own home, too close for comfort. One rainy afternoon, I drove out to the property. The house was in a state of disrepair, its windows broken and the yard overgrown with weeds. There was something eerie about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end as I stood outside, staring at the decaying structure. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go inside. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I walked through the house, my footsteps slow and deliberate. It was a strange sensation, like stepping into someone else's life, someone whose presence still lingered in every corner. In the living room, I found an old chair, draped with a moth-eaten blanket, as though someone had left it hastily. There were remnants of Eleanor's life scattered throughout the house, faded photographs, crumpled papers, and broken pieces of furniture. But there was nothing that could explain the connection between her diary and my family. I stood in the middle of the room, frustration bubbling up inside me. The silence was deafening, the oppressive weight of the house closing in around me. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye, an old box, half buried under a pile of debris in the corner. I knelt down and opened it. Inside, there were more pages, loose and yellowed with age, written in the same handwriting as Eleanor's diary. As I carefully sifted through them, my breath caught in my throat. The pages were filled with descriptions of me, my childhood, my family, my life, all written in vivid detail. Eleanor had been watching me, documenting my life just as she had documented her own. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me as I realized the truth. Eleanor wasn't just writing about her own experiences. She had somehow crossed into my life, her presence lingering long after her death. I left the house that day, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The attic, once a place of forgotten memories, had become a place of fear, a reminder of the connection between Eleanor's life and my own. I put the diary back in the attic, locking it away. But I couldn't lock away the fear it had instilled in me. Every night, I hear the same footsteps Eleanor wrote about, growing louder, coming closer. And now I wonder, am I next? Story 6. The photo albums. The photo albums had always been a cherished part of my life. For years, they had been my way of preserving memories, birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, vacations with friends. Each album was a carefully curated collection of moments, a visual diary that marked the passage of time and the people I held dear. Whenever I felt nostalgic, I'd flip through those albums, losing myself in the sea of smiling faces and shared joy. It was a rainy afternoon when I first discovered something wrong. I had decided to clean out the attic, a task long overdue, and in the process I came across the stack of old photo albums I hadn't looked at in years. Covered in a thin layer of dust, they seemed to call to me, promising a warm trip down memory lane. With a smile, I carried them downstairs to the living room, settled on the couch, and began flipping through the pages. At first, it was the same familiar flood of happiness. Faces I hadn't seen in years grinned up at me, and each picture brought back the stories behind them: Grandma's birthday, our first family trip to the beach, high school graduation. I was immersed in the warmth of those memories, completely at ease. But then, something strange caught my eye. I turned the page to find a photograph that didn't belong. It was subtle at first, something I might have overlooked if I hadn't been paying close attention. The photo featured a family gathering I vividly remembered, but standing in the background, barely noticeable, was a figure I didn't recognize. It was a man, dressed in outdated clothes, his face partially obscured by shadow. He wasn't interacting with anyone in the photo, just standing there, watching. A chill ran down my spine as I leaned in closer. I knew everyone in that picture, family, friends, and this man wasn't one of them. How could I not have noticed him before? I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just a distant relative or a friend of someone who had been there that day. I continued flipping through the album, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the back of my mind. And then it happened again. On the very next page, I found another unfamiliar face. This time, it was a woman sitting at a table during a family reunion. She wasn't interacting with anyone in the photo either, just sitting there, staring straight ahead, her expression blank. I didn't know her. I had never seen her before. My heart began to race. Who were these people? How had they ended up in my photos? I flipped through the rest of the album more quickly now, scanning each page with a growing sense of dread. To my horror, more and more strangers began to appear. They weren't in every photo, but they were there, lurking in the background, sitting quietly in the corners, always watching. It was as if they had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, and I had never noticed. The further I went, the worse it got. The strangers became more prominent, more deliberate. I found photos where they were sitting next to my family members, blending in as though they were part of the group, but I knew they weren't. They didn't belong in my life, in my memories. Frantically, I grabbed another album and opened it, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. It was the same story strangers, people I didn't recognize, appearing in my most cherished memories. Sometimes they were alone, other times they were in pairs, always looking straight at the camera with vacant expressions, as though they knew I would find them. The unease I had felt earlier bloomed into full-blown panic. I threw the album aside and grabbed another, and another. The strangers were in all of them, woven into my past as if they had always been there, their presence unmistakable. I couldn't understand it. Who were they? How had they ended up in my photo albums? Was it some kind of elaborate prank? But who would go to such lengths? These photos had been sitting untouched for years, locked away in the attic where no one could have tampered with them. I flipped back to one of the earliest albums, a collection of childhood photos from when I was just a toddler. Surely the strangers wouldn't be there, but they were. I found a photo of my first birthday party, the one my mother always told me about. The picture showed me sitting in front of my birthday cake, my parents on either side, smiling down at me. But there in the background, standing by the doorway, was a man I had never seen before. He was watching us. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I stared at the man in the photo. His eyes were fixed on me, as though he had been waiting for me to notice him all these years later. I couldn't look away. My hands trembled as I touched the photo, tracing the outline of his figure. He didn't look like a guest, didn't look like someone who had just happened to be there. His presence was deliberate, almost intentional. I slammed the album shut, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the strangers in the photos. The images haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those blank, emotionless expressions, always staring, always watching. I stopped looking at the albums, afraid of what else I might find. But the fear didn't stop there. A few days later, I came home to find one of the albums open on the coffee table. I was certain I had left it closed. I hadn't touched it since that first day, so how had it gotten there? My first thought was that someone had broken into my home, but nothing else had been disturbed. The doors and windows were all locked, and nothing appeared to be missing. It was just the album, sitting there, open to the page where I had first noticed the man at my birthday party. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Someone was playing with me. But who and why? I sat down on the couch, staring at the photo, feeling the weight of the man's gaze. There was something deeply unsettling about him, something that made my skin crawl. I needed answers. I had to know who these people were, why they had appeared in my photos, and what they wanted from me. I took the album to the local police station, hoping they could help me make sense of it. The officer who took my report was polite but skeptical, flipping through the pages with a frown. "Looks like a case of mistaken identity," he said, shrugging. "Probably just some mix-up with the photo development back in the day. It happens." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that there was some rational explanation for what was happening, but deep down I knew there wasn't. These people weren't random. They had been inserted into my life, my memories, deliberately. The police didn't find anything suspicious, and there was nothing they could do. I went home, feeling more alone and vulnerable than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept imagining the strangers from the photos standing outside my window, watching, waiting for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up to find another photo album open on the coffee table. This time, the page was turned to a picture of me and my friends from high school, and standing in the background, half hidden behind a tree, was a woman I didn't recognize. She was smiling. My hands shook as I slammed the album shut and shoved it back into the box with the others. I didn't want to look anymore. I didn't want to see what other horrors were waiting for me in those photos. I packed the albums away, hiding them deep in the attic, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But it didn't. The feeling of being watched never left me. Weeks passed, and I started receiving strange, anonymous letters in the mail. They were brief, cryptic messages that left me more confused and terrified than ever. You can't escape your past one-letter read. Another simply said, "They're still watching." The fear that had started with the photo albums had now grown into a living nightmare. The strangers weren't just confined to my past, they were creeping into my present, reminding me that no matter where I went, they would always be there. I don't look at the photo albums anymore. I keep them locked away in the attic. But sometimes, late at night, I hear strange noises coming from above. I tell myself it's just the house settling, just the wind moving things around. But deep down, I know the truth. They're still watching. Story 7. The Forgotten Room. When I bought the house, I thought I knew every inch of it. I had spent months inspecting it, falling in love with its creaky floors and vintage charm. It was an old Victorian-style home, the kind that felt like it had a soul, with its intricately carved wooden banisters and stained glass windows. The realtor had told me that it had been built in the early 1900s and had passed through several generations before it was finally put up for sale. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. For the first few months, everything was idyllic. The house was as peaceful as I had hoped, a sanctuary from the chaos of city life. But one rainy evening, as I was going through some old paperwork in the attic, I stumbled upon a set of blueprints. They were yellowed with age, the edges curling, but I could make out the detailed floor plan of the house. And that's when I noticed something strange. There, on the second floor, was a room that didn't exist. According to the blueprints, it should have been right between the guest bedroom and the small bathroom. But in reality, there was nothing but a blank wall. I had walked through that hallway dozens of times and never once had I noticed anything out of the ordinary. I chalked it up to a mistake, maybe an old design that had been revised, or a wall that had been sealed off for some reason over the years. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I grabbed a tape measure and headed upstairs to check it out. I measured the length of the hallway, then compared it to the measurements on the blueprints. Sure enough, there was a discrepancy about 10 feet of space unaccounted for. That's when the unease set in. Why would someone seal off a room? And if they did, what was inside? Determined to find out, I began knocking on the walls, listening for any hollow sounds. Most of the walls gave the usual solid thud, but when I reached the section where the room should have been, the sound changed. It was faint, but there a hollow echo, as though there was empty space behind the wall. My heart began to race. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and returned to the hallway, my palms sweaty with anticipation. With a few hard swings, I broke through the plaster. Dust filled the air, and I had to step back for a moment, coughing as the fine particles settled around me. But when the dust cleared, I saw a wooden door, concealed behind the plaster, its surface old and weathered. The door didn't have a knob, just a keyhole, but it was intact. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether I should proceed. Something about it felt wrong, like I was about to uncover something that had been hidden for a reason. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I rummaged through a drawer downstairs, hoping to find a key that might fit, but none of them worked. Frustrated, I decided to take a more direct approach. I pried at the door with a crowbar until the wood gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung open, revealing a narrow, dark room. I stood at the threshold, shining a flashlight into the space. It was small, barely more than a closet, with thick dust coating every surface. But the air inside felt different, stale and heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, and beside it, a small table with something resting on it. I stepped inside cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air seemed to grow colder with each step. When I reached the table, I saw what had been left there, a small, leather-bound journal, covered in dust and worn with age. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, brushing off the dirt to reveal the initials E.W. embossed on the cover. I flipped open the journal, the pages brittle under my touch. The handwriting inside was neat, methodical, written in a looping script that was difficult to read at first. The entries were dated, beginning in the year 1923. As I read, a deep unease settled over me. The journal belonged to a man named Edward Winton, the original owner of the house. His early entries were mundane, recounting his day-to-day life work, the weather, his thoughts on the house. But as the entries progressed, they grew darker, more frantic. Edward wrote about strange occurrences in the house, things he couldn't explain. He heard footsteps at night when no one was there, saw shadows moving across the walls that shouldn't have been. Objects in the house began to disappear, only to reappear in odd places. At first, he tried to rationalize it, but over time, his tone grew more desperate. One entry, dated July 13th, 1924, made my blood run cold. I've sealed the room. It's the only way. I don't know what else to do. The noises won't stop, and the shadows, they're getting closer. I can feel it watching me. It's always watching. I closed the journal, my hand shaking. Edward had sealed this room for a reason. Whatever had driven him to do it, he had been terrified. I glanced around the small, claustrophobic space, suddenly hyper-aware of the thick silence pressing in on me. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, near the base of the wall, was a small, dark stain on the floorboards. It was subtle, easy to miss, but the more I looked at it, the more it seemed to grow like a shadow spreading across the wood. My heart pounded as I bent down to inspect it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The stain wasn't just a mark on the floor. It was wet. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching it with my fingertips. A cold, sticky sensation met my skin, and when I pulled my hand back, my fingers were stained red. Blood. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What had happened in this room? Why had it been hidden away for so long? And most importantly, what had Edward Winton been so afraid of? I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. For the next few days, I couldn't bring myself to go near that part of the house. The door loomed in the hallway like a dark secret, a reminder of the terror that had once gripped the house. But as much as I tried to ignore it, strange things began to happen. At night, I heard faint footsteps coming from the hallway, soft creaks and groans that echoed through the house. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Keys I had left on the kitchen counter would turn up in the living room. Doors I knew I had closed would be open when I returned. And the shadows, those shadows Edward had written about, they began to appear. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape that would disappear as soon as I turned my head. But over time, they became more pronounced, more deliberate. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I was certain I had closed it before going to bed, but now it stood ajar, the darkness of the hallway spilling into the room. As I lay there, frozen in fear, I heard the soft, deliberate creak of floorboards just outside my door. Someone or something was in the house. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting, listening, but all I heard was silence. And then, slowly, the door began to close on its own. The next morning, I boarded up the room. I couldn't live with the knowledge of what was inside, couldn't stand the thought of that dark, forgotten space lurking just beyond the wall. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary had become a place of dread, and no amount of rational thinking could erase the terror that had taken hold of me. I've tried to move on, to forget about the room and the secrets it holds. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint creak of floorboards, the soft rustle of footsteps in the hallway, and I know it's still there. Waiting. Story 8. The shadow in the mirror. I've never liked mirrors. There's something unsettling about them. The way they reflect not just the room around you, but the feeling that they might be showing something more, something you can't quite see. It's irrational, I know, but the feeling has haunted me since childhood. When I moved into my new apartment, it was sleek and modern, complete with polished floors, granite countertops, and mirrors, lots of them. There was one in almost every room, the hallway, the living room, even the bedroom. I didn't mind them at first. They were part of the decor, a design choice I thought I could get used to. It wasn't long before things started to feel off. It began with the bedroom mirror. I would catch glimpses of movement in and out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that were gone before I could look directly at Donnerstadt. At first, I assumed it was just my imagination or maybe the light playing tricks on me, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a dark shape, just behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped around, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, still showed the shadow for a split second longer, lingering in the reflection even after I had turned away. I stared at the mirror, my pulse quickening. There was nothing in the room, but I could have sworn that shadow had been right behind me, close enough to touch. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I was tired, that I'd been working too much, but the unease followed me to bed, and sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that shadow creeping closer, waiting just beyond my line of sight. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the mirror became a source of growing anxiety for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it, that it was more than just a simple reflection of the room. I started avoiding it, going out of my way to not look directly at it, but that didn't stop the strange sensations. It wasn't just my bedroom mirror either. The others, especially the one in the hallway, seemed to be playing tricks on me too. I'd glance at them briefly and see odd distortions in the reflection, subtle movements that didn't match my own. Sometimes the room would seem darker in the reflection than it actually was, as though the mirrors were showing a version of the apartment that didn't quite belong to the reality I was living in. One evening, I invited a couple of friends over for dinner. I hoped that having company would distract me from the growing sense of unease, and for a while it worked. We laughed, drank wine, and enjoyed a nice meal together. But after dinner, as we were sitting in the living room, something strange happened. My friend Lily was the first to notice it. "Hey, do you see that?" she asked, frowning as she stared at the large mirror hanging on the wall. "There's something weird about it." I followed her gaze, dread tightening in my chest. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just our reflections sitting on the couch. But then I noticed the shadows. They were darker in the mirror, elongated and unnatural. The room behind us seemed wrong, as though the reflection were showing a different version of the apartment, one that was slightly off. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Lily got up and moved closer to the mirror, inspecting it carefully. "I don't know. It's like the reflection is delayed or something, like it's not quite in sync with what's happening here." I watched as she waved her hand in front of the mirror. Her reflection followed, but there was a slight lag, a fraction of a second where the movement didn't match up. My stomach twisted with unease. "I think it's just the lighting," I said, trying to dismiss it, but the look on Lily's face told me she didn't believe me. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirrors. Even after my friends had left, I found myself avoiding them, not wanting to see what they might reveal. I covered the one in the hallway with a blanket, telling myself it was temporary, just until I figured out what was going on. But the shadows didn't stop. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the direction of the mirror. It was a faint whispering, like someone muttering just out of earshot. I sat up, straining to hear it. The sound grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as though the voice was speaking from within the mirror itself. My pulse raced, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light, but the whispering continued. It was soft, insistent, like it was calling to me. I forced myself to get out of bed and approach the mirror, my hands trembling. The whispering stopped as I got closer, replaced by an eerie silence. For a long moment, I stared at my reflection, waiting for something to happen. And then, slowly, the shadow appeared. It began as a faint shape in the corner of the mirror, barely visible, like a trick of the light. But as I watched, it grew darker, more defined. It wasn't my reflection, or anything in the room. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The shadow stood just behind me in the reflection, tall and indistinct, as though it were made of smoke. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a primal instinct to run, to get as far away from that mirror as possible, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the thing that had appeared behind me. Then it started to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadow crept closer to my reflection. I could feel it. Even though it wasn't physically in the room with me, I could feel the air grow colder, could sense its presence looming behind me, watching, waiting. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but finally something in me snapped, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my haste to get away from the mirror. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the glass, covering it completely. The whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the covered mirror, waiting for something to happen, but the room remained silent, the shadow hidden behind the blanket. The next morning, I called a repairman to come and take down the mirrors. I didn't care about the cost, I just wanted them gone. The mirrors had been there when I moved in, and I hadn't thought twice about them, but now I couldn't stand the thought of them in my home. When the repairman arrived, I hovered nearby, anxious to see the mirrors removed. He worked quickly, prying the mirrors off the walls one by one, but as he pulled down the mirror in the bedroom, something caught my eye. Behind the glass, embedded in the wall, were strange symbols. They had been etched into the plaster, faint but unmistakable. I stepped closer, my stomach churning as I recognized the shapes. They weren't just random markings. They looked like runes or some kind of ritualistic symbols. "What's that?" I asked, my voice shaking. The repairman shrugged, clearly unbothered. "Looks like old markings from when the house was built. Probably nothing to worry about." But I wasn't convinced. There was something about those symbols, something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't help but wonder if they had something to do with the mirrors, if they had been put there for a reason. After the mirrors were gone, the house felt different. The whispering stopped, and the shadows disappeared, but the unease lingered, a constant reminder of what I had seen. I never found out what those symbols meant, or why they had been hidden behind the mirrors. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the lights are low, I swear I can still feel the shadow watching me, waiting for the day the mirrors return. Story 9. The Stranger at the Window. It was late in the evening when I first noticed him. The autumn air had a chill to it, and the wind was rattling the windows of my small house as I sat alone, curled up on the couch with a book. The soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the living room, and outside the trees swayed in the breeze, their branches scraping against the glass. I had always liked the quiet of living on the outskirts of town, where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the nights were still and peaceful. But on that particular night, something felt different. Something felt wrong. I can't say exactly what made me look up from my book, but a strange sensation crept over me, a prickling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. At first, I ignored it, brushing it off as nerves or the result of being too absorbed in the suspenseful novel I was reading. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I glanced toward the window, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just outside, his face barely visible in the dim light. He was tall, his frame shadowed by the trees behind him, but I could make out enough to see that he was staring directly at me. His features were partially obscured by the reflection of the room in the glass, but I could feel his eyes locked on mine. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my mind racing. Who was he? How long had he been standing there, watching me? The nearest road was a good distance from the house, and I hadn't heard a car or footsteps approaching. The man shouldn't have been there. I blinked, half expecting him to disappear when I looked again, but he didn't. He remained still, unmoving, just staring at me through the window. A surge of panic coursed through me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the local police. My eyes never left the figure outside, but as soon as I raised the phone to my ear, something strange happened. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a slow, deliberate grin that sent a chill down my spine. There was something wrong with it, something unnatural, as though he was enjoying my fear. His teeth gleamed in the faint light, sharp and white against the darkness of his face. I pressed the phone to my ear, but when I listened, I realized the line was dead. There was no dial tone, no sound at all, just silence. I looked down at the screen, no signal. My pulse quickened, and I backed away from the window, my mind spinning. The man's grin widened, his gaze never wavering as I retreated further into the room. I could feel his eyes following me, tracking my every movement. I ran to the front door, making sure it was locked, then checked all the windows, pulling the curtains shut. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands shook as I fumbled with the latches, trying to shut out the sight of him. But even after I'd closed all the blinds, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there just outside, waiting. I spent the next few hours huddled on the couch, my ears straining for any sound. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind made my skin crawl. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see the man's face pressed against the glass, that same sinister grin staring back at me. But there was nothing. No knock at the door, no sign of movement outside. The house was silent. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off to sleep on the couch, my body too tired to keep up with my racing thoughts. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the cracks in the curtains. For a moment, I lay there disoriented, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the night before. Had it been a dream? A trick of the light? Maybe I'd let my imagination get the better of me. I cautiously opened the curtains and looked outside. There was no one there. No sign that anyone had been near the house. The yard was empty, and the only footprints in the dewy grass were my own, from earlier that morning. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I went to the kitchen to make coffee, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the windowsill, were faint smudges, handprints. They were too large to be mine, too precise to be accidental, and they were positioned exactly where the man had been standing the night before. My hands shook as I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers tracing the outline of the prints. They were real. Someone had been there. Someone had watched me from the window, just inches away. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. I tried to go about my usual routine, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. Every time I walked past a window, I felt the urge to look outside, to check if he had returned, but I never saw anything. The yard remained empty, and the house was silent. That night, I made sure every door was locked, every window secured. I even placed a heavy chair against the front door, as though that would stop him from getting in. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. If he wanted to come back, he would find a way. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up at the slightest sound, my heart racing every time the wind rattled the windows or the house creaked. But the man didn't return. Not that night, at least. A few days passed, and I began to convince myself that maybe it had just been a random trespasser or hiker who had wandered too far off the trail, or someone playing a prank. But the handprints on the window told a different story. They were deliberate, and the memory of that smile haunted me. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I felt that same creeping sensation that someone was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to turn over, my eyes scanning the darkened room. There, in the window, was the man. He stood just outside, his face pressed against the glass, his hands resting lightly on the window pane. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and that same twisted grin stretched across his face. I bolted upright, my body frozen with fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of the man at the window. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me, smiling. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, staring back at him, too terrified to move. The room was cold, the air thick with dread. And then, without warning, the man's smile slowly faded. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching my phone, waiting for morning to come. As soon as the sun rose, I called the police again, desperate for help. When they arrived, they found nothing. No footprints. No handprints on the window this time, just an empty yard and a terrified woman with a story they didn't seem to believe. Probably just a prank, one of the officers said, trying to reassure me. We'll keep an eye on the area, but I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. But I knew better. And the man would come back. I could feel it. The next few nights passed in a haze of fear. Every noise, every shadow outside made my heart race. I barely slept, constantly checking the windows, waiting for him to return. But he didn't show up again, at least not when I was looking. Then, one morning, I found something that shattered whatever illusion of safety I had left. On the back of the house, hidden from view of the road and the neighboring houses, was a message. Scrawled in the dirt on the window were 3 words. See you soon. Story 10, The Silent Call. It was around midnight when the phone rang. The sharp trill cut through the quiet of my apartment, jolting me awake from a deep sleep. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, disoriented by the sudden noise. Who could be calling at this hour? I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a familiar name or number, but instead, the display showed something strange. Unknown number dot. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button. I didn't usually answer calls from unknown numbers, especially not in the middle of the night. But something made me pick up the phone this time, a gut feeling that I couldn't quite explain. Hello, I said, my voice groggy and laced with irritation. There was no response, just silence. Hello, I repeated, louder this time. Maybe it was a bad connection. Maybe the caller had accidentally dialed my number. I waited for a few more seconds, straining to hear any sound on the other end of the line, but there was nothing. No static, no background noise, just an eerie, empty silence. I hung up, tossing the phone back onto the nightstand with a sigh. It was probably just a wrong number. People dial the wrong number all the time, right? But as I lay back down, pulling the covers over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Just as I started to drift off to sleep again, the phone rang a second time. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I grabbed the phone, my hand trembling slightly as I checked the screen. Unknown number dot. The same number or lack thereof. I didn't want to answer it again, but curiosity, or perhaps some deeper instinct, pushed me to tap the screen. Hello, I said cautiously. Again, there was only silence. The same empty, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. My skin prickled with unease. I listened intently, waiting for something, anything, but there was no response. I hung up again, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just a random wrong number. Something about the silence on the other end felt deliberate, like someone was there but refusing to speak. I tried to convince myself that it was just a prank. After all, people prank call others all the time, especially with unknown numbers. But why now? Why in the middle of the night? I lay back down, staring up at the ceiling, but sleep refused to come. My mind was racing, replaying the sound of that silence over and over again. There was something unsettling about it, something that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. The phone rang a third time. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the phone and answered immediately. Who is this? I demanded, my voice sharp with a mix of anger and fear. Silence. Who are you? I repeated, my voice shaking now. Why are you calling me? For a long moment, there was nothing but that same heavy silence. And then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. A faint, barely audible whisper. It was so quiet that I almost thought I had imagined it, but it was there, just at the edge of the silence. I strained to listen, my blood running cold as the whisper grew slightly louder. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a shiver down my spine. It was low, breathy, almost like someone was standing right next to me, murmuring into my ear. Who is this? I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper now, my mouth dry with fear. The whisper stopped, and then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I just heard? Who had been on the other end of the line? I replayed the sound in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but it only left me with more questions. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint whisper, that eerie silence. I kept checking my phone, half expecting it to ring again, but it stayed silent. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The unknown caller haunted my thoughts, lingering in the back of my mind like a dark cloud. I found myself constantly checking my phone, dreading the possibility of another call. And then, just as I was beginning to think it had all been some strange coincidence, the phone rang again. It was around the same time, just after midnight, and the screen showed the same message, unknown number. My hands trembled as I stared at the phone, the familiar dread creeping up my spine. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to hear that whisper again, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know who it was, why they were doing this. I pressed the answer button and raised the phone to my ear. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaky and desperate. The silence was there again, thick and suffocating, but this time it didn't last as long. After just a few seconds, I heard the whisper. It was louder this time, clearer, though still too faint to understand fully. I listened carefully, my heart racing, trying to make out the words. And then I heard it. One word, just one. Come. A. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something chilling about it. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong on the other end of the phone. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no response. Just silence, followed by the soft click of the line going dead. I dropped the phone onto the bed, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That one word echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Come. Come where? What did it mean? Who was calling me, and why? I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, clutching my phone, terrified that it would ring again, but it didn't. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the rustling of the wind outside. But even the familiar sounds felt different now, like they were part of something darker. I couldn't stop thinking about that whisper, that single word. It played over and over in my head, each time more sinister than the last. The next night, the phone rang again. I didn't answer it this time. I let it ring, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the screen. The call ended after a few rings, but not long after, it started again. And again. And again. Each time, the same unknown number flashed across the screen, and each time I ignored it. But the ringing didn't stop. It kept coming, relentless, like the caller wouldn't give up until I answered. I finally turned off my phone, hoping to get some relief from the incessant ringing. But even with the phone off, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that the caller wasn't finished with me. The calls continued for the next few nights. Each time I ignored them, but the fear gnawed at me, growing stronger with every ring. The whispers haunted my dreams, that single word come echoing in my mind like a dark, inescapable command. One night, after the phone had rung for what felt like the 100th time, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the phone, my hands trembling, and answered it. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice raw with fear and frustration. There was no whisper this time. Instead, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, like someone was standing just behind me, listening to every word I said. I froze, the phone pressed to my ear, as the breathing continued. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could do was listen. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. "I'm here," the voice whispered. The call ended, and the line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. I haven't slept properly since, because now every time I walk through my house, I feel that presence, that unseen force watching me, waiting. And I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. Story 11. The figure in the fog. The fog rolled in thick and heavy that evening, blanketing the streets in a dense, white shroud. I had lived in this town my whole life, and fog wasn't unusual here, especially in late autumn. But that night, it felt different, heavier, more oppressive, like the world outside was being swallowed by something vast and unknowable. I was on my way home from work, driving along the familiar stretch of road that wound through the outskirts of town. The headlights of my car barely cut through the fog, the beam swallowed up by the swirling mist. I had to slow down to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I peered out into the haze. The world outside felt strange, disconnected, like I was driving through a place I didn't recognize. The trees that usually lined the road were nothing more than dark silhouettes now, their shapes distorted by the fog. Every few minutes, the wind would carry faint sounds, whispers, rustling leaves, but it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. As I drove deeper into the fog, a sense of unease began to creep over me. I had taken this road 100 times before, but now it felt like I was heading somewhere unknown, somewhere I shouldn't be. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, trying to gauge how much further I had to go before I reached my house. The drive usually took about 20 minutes, but it felt like I had been on the road for hours. My stomach twisted with anxiety as the fog pressed in around me, thickening with every mile. Then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, barely visible through the fog. I thought it was a tree, or maybe a signpost at the side of the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else, someone standing in the middle of the road. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a sudden halt. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, shrouded in the thick mist, just a few feet ahead of me. I strained to see through the windshield, but the fog was too thick. I could only make out the vague outline of the figure, a tall, shadowy shape, human but wrong. Somehow, the way it stood there, motionless, made my skin crawl. For a few moments, I just sat there, frozen with indecision. Should I get out and see if they needed help? Or should I just drive around them and keep going? Something about the way the figure stood there, so still and silent, made me uneasy. I rolled down the window, leaning out to get a better look. "Hey," I called, my voice shaky. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. I squinted through the fog, trying to make out more details, but the mist seemed to cling to the figure, obscuring it in an unnatural way. "Do you need help?" I called again, louder this time. Still, no response. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. There was something wrong about this. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there, to leave this figure behind and never look back. But I couldn't move. I was stuck in place, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure in the road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure moved. It wasn't a normal movement. It was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. The figure took a single step toward the car, its limbs moving stiffly like a puppet being dragged forward. My stomach lurched with fear, and I instinctively put the car into reverse, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. But before I could react, the figure took another step, and then another. My heart raced as the figure approached the car, still shrouded in fog, its features impossible to make out. All I could see was the outline of a dark shape, towering and unnaturally still except for its slow, jerky movements. I threw the car into reverse and hit the gas, the tires squealing as I backed away from the figure. The car lurched backward, but the fog was so thick that I couldn't see where I was going. Panic surged through me as I glanced between the rearview mirror and the figure in front of me. It kept coming. Slowly, methodically, it walked toward the car, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were watching me. The closer it got, the colder the air in the car became. I could feel the temperature drop, see my breath misting in front of me as frost began to form on the inside of the windows. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. My hands shook as I shifted into drive, ready to floor it and escape. But when I looked up again, the figure was gone. I blinked, my mind racing. 1 second, it had been right there moving toward me, almost close enough to touch, and the next, it had vanished into the fog. I sat there, my heart pounding, staring into the empty road. The fog swirled around the car, thick and impenetrable, but there was no sign of the figure. No shadow, no movement. Just an empty stretch of road disappearing into the mist. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. With a shaky hand, I put the car in gear and pressed down on the gas, speeding through the fog as fast as I dared. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of trick of the fog, a shadow that my mind had turned into something more? But I knew what I had seen. The figure had been real too real. I drove for what felt like hours, the fog never lifting, the road ahead of me stretching on and on into the distance. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist and the empty road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint outline of my house in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of my home, a welcome comfort after the strange events of the night. But as I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There in the fog, just beyond the edge of the driveway, was the figure. It was standing still again, its dark outline barely visible through the mist, but it was there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran inside, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I listened. For a few moments, there was only silence. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the driveway. I stumbled back from the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed my phone, dialing the police. The line rang once, twice, but before anyone could answer, the footsteps stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The fog outside pressed against the windows, thick and heavy, but I couldn't see the figure anymore. It was gone. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. I explained what had happened as best I could, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They checked around the house, found no signs of anyone being there, and assured me it was probably just a trick of the fog. But I knew better. I never saw the figure again after that night, but every time the fog rolls in, thick and heavy, I can't help but feel like it's still out there waiting for me. And sometimes, late at night, when the fog is at its thickest, I hear the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps just outside my window. Waiting. Story 12. The locked door. The door at the end of the hallway had always been locked. I knew that from the first day I moved into the old house. The landlord had shown me around, explaining the quirks of the century-old property, pointing out the heavy wooden door at the far end of the upstairs corridor. Just storage, he had said, his tone casual but firm. No need to worry about it. It stays locked. At the time, I hadn't given it much thought. The house was large, with plenty of space for me and more storage than I'd ever need. The locked door was just another part of the house's charm, an old door that likely led to a small, forgotten attic space, or so I assumed. But as the weeks passed, I found myself drawn to it. There was something about that door, something unsettling. Every time I walked past it, I felt a strange pull, an odd sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the door itself, it was what lay behind it, or more accurately, what I didn't know about it. At night, the house creaked and groaned like all old houses do, the wind whistling softly through the cracks in the windows. But some nights, I swore I heard something different sounds coming from behind the door. It was faint, barely audible over the usual noises of the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in there, just beyond the locked door. I told myself I was imagining it. Old houses make noise. Drafts, pipes, even small animals can explain away the sounds I was hearing. But the more I ignored it, the stronger the feeling grew. That door, locked and untouched, was hiding something, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the door. The house was quiet, unusually so, and the hallway seemed darker than usual, the shadows stretching long across the floor. I took a step closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. I knew I shouldn't be obsessing over it after all. The landlord had said it was just storage, but that explanation no longer satisfied me. I needed to know what was behind that door. Without thinking, I reached for the handle, half expecting it to turn in my hand, but of course it didn't. The door remained locked, just as it always had been. I sighed, frustrated, and was about to walk away when something stopped me. a sound. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper. I pressed my ear to the door, listening intently. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the silence of the house. But then I heard it again, an unmistakable shuffling noise, like something moving on the other side. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My rational mind told me it was nothing, probably just an animal that had found its way into the walls or an old pipe making noise. But the deeper part of me, the part that had been dreading this moment, knew better. There was something in there. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the door. The noises continued, soft, irregular sounds that came and went at odd times. Sometimes it sounded like shuffling or scraping, other times like the faintest whisper of movement, as though someone or something was pacing back and forth. I knew I had to do something. I needed to get inside, but the door was locked, and I didn't have the key. That evening, I called the landlord. "Hey, I was wondering about the locked door upstairs," I said, trying to sound casual. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped, but then the landlord's voice came through, low and hesitant. "What about it?" he asked. "Well, I've been hearing some strange noises coming from behind it," I explained. "It's probably nothing, but I was wondering if I could check it out. Do you have a key?" There was another long pause. "I told you, it's just storage," he said, his tone more clipped this time. "There's no reason to go in there." But I started to protest, but he cut me off. "Leave it alone," he said, his voice firm. "Trust me, you don't want to open that door." He hung up before I could say anything else, leaving me standing there with the phone in my hand, more confused than ever. Why didn't he want me to open the door? What was he hiding? The landlord's warning only fueled my curiosity, making me more determined than ever to find out what was behind that door. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a lock-picking set. I had never picked a lock before, but I figured it couldn't be that hard. I watched a few tutorials online, and after a couple of failed attempts, I managed to get the hang of it. That night, when the house was quiet and still, I made my move. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the door. The hallway was dark, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like a heavy fog. I knelt in front of the door, my hands shaking as I inserted the picks into the lock. For a few agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The lock was stubborn, old, and resistant, but just as I was about to give up, I heard a soft click. The door was unlocked. I stared at the handle, my heart racing. This was it. I could finally find out what had been bothering me all this time. I reached out, grasping the cold metal, and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading downward. I hadn't expected that. The door hadn't led to an attic or a storage room, it led to a basement, one I hadn't known existed. A cold draft wafted up from the darkness below, sending a chill down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct in my body telling me to close the door and forget I had ever opened it, but I couldn't stop now. I had come this far, and I needed to know what was down there. I grabbed a flashlight from my pocket and stepped inside. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of mildew was strong. I shone the flashlight around, revealing a bare stone floor and walls covered in thick cobwebs. The basement was small, cramped, and eerily silent. At first, I thought the room was empty, but then the beam of my flashlight landed on something in the far corner. A chair. And sitting in the chair was a figure, hunched over, its back to me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took an involuntary step back. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, motionless, as though it hadn't noticed me. I shone the flashlight directly at it, my hand trembling. The light revealed more details: a pale, gaunt figure, dressed in ragged clothing, its hair matted and tangled. The skin was stretched tight over its bones, and it looked like it hadn't moved in years. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and flee, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the figure in the chair. And then, slowly, it began to turn. The The creak of its joints was deafening in the silence of the basement. It moved with a deliberate slowness, as though it hadn't moved in years. And as it turned to face me, I saw its eyes. Empty, hollow sockets stared back at me, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as I scrambled for the stairs. The darkness swallowed the basement, but I could still hear it moving slow, shuffling steps coming closer. I didn't stop running until I was outside the house, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back. The landlord didn't answer my calls after that. I packed my things and left the house the next day, unable to shake the image of that figure from my mind. I don't know what I saw in that basement or why the landlord had locked it away, but I'll never forget the warning he gave me. Some doors are meant to stay locked. Story 13. The mirror in the attic. The day I found the mirror in the attic, everything changed. I had moved into the house only a month earlier, a quiet, old place tucked away at the edge of town, far enough from the city to offer some peace, but close enough that I didn't feel completely isolated. The house had character. It was the kind of place with creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and narrow hallways. But like many old houses, it also had its share of quirks, strange drafts, odd noises at night, and an attic that I hadn't explored since moving in. I had stored a few boxes up there, but something about the attic always made me uncomfortable. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and I avoided going up there unless I absolutely had to. One rainy afternoon, with nothing else to do, I decided it was time to organize the attic properly. I climbed the narrow stairs, the wooden steps groaning under my weight, and pushed open the attic door. Dust particles floated through the air, illuminated by the weak light filtering in from the small window. As I moved some boxes around, I noticed something tucked away in the corner, hidden beneath an old sheet. Curiosity piqued. I pulled the sheet away, revealing an old, ornate mirror. The frame was made of heavy, dark wood, intricately carved with swirling patterns and symbols I didn't recognize. The glass was slightly cloudy, like it hadn't been cleaned in decades, but it was otherwise intact. I stared at my reflection, distorted slightly by the age of the glass. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My reflection seemed slower, somehow like it wasn't quite keeping up with my movements. I raised my hand and my reflection followed, but there was a slight delay, just enough to unsettle me. I shook my head, laughing at myself for being paranoid. It was just an old mirror. The delay was probably due to the warped glass or the dim lighting in the attic. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about it. I decided to bring the mirror downstairs. It was too beautiful to be left gathering dust in the attic, and it might look nice in the living room or hallway. I lugged it down the narrow staircase and propped it up in the corner of the living room, admiring how the ornate frame added a touch of elegance to the otherwise plain space. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the usual noises of the old house that kept me awake. It was something else, an unease that I couldn't explain. I tossed and turned, my mind drifting back to the mirror in the living room. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way my reflection had seemed so off. Finally, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, I got out of bed and made my way downstairs. The house was dark and quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, my eyes were drawn to the mirror. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. The room was bathed in shadows, and the mirror's glass reflected only the faintest glimmers of moonlight from the window. But as I moved closer, I saw my reflection standing in the mirror, watching me. But I wasn't moving. I froze, staring at the glass in disbelief. My reflection was standing perfectly still, its eyes locked onto mine. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I must be dreaming. But I wasn't. Slowly, I raised my hand, expecting my reflection to follow, but it didn't. The reflection remained motionless, its expression unchanging, its eyes cold and empty. A shiver ran down my spine as I took a step closer to the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, without warning, my reflection smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile, one that didn't reach its eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled back, horrified. My reflection was staring at me, smiling, but I wasn't smiling. I wasn't moving at all. Panic surged through me, and I turned away from the mirror, rushing back upstairs to my bedroom. I slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain: something was very, very wrong with that mirror. I didn't go back downstairs that night. I stayed in my bedroom, wide awake, too afraid to sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside set my heart racing, and all I could think about was that twisted reflection in the mirror. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe I had been half asleep, maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The reflection had moved on its own. It had smiled at me. I decided to get rid of the mirror. I hauled it back up to the attic, my hands trembling as I shoved it into the corner and threw the sheet back over it. I wanted to forget I had ever found it, to pretend it had never existed. But even as I closed the attic door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was still watching me, waiting. For the next few days, I avoided the attic. I kept busy with work and other tasks, trying to distract myself from the lingering unease. But the house felt different now, darker, colder, as though the mirror's presence had changed something. Every time I walked past the attic door, I felt its pull, like it was beckoning me to come closer. Then, one night, the nightmares began. I dreamed that I was standing in front of the mirror again, but this time my reflection didn't just smile. It moved, slowly at first, then more deliberately. It stepped out of the mirror, its cold eyes locked onto mine. I tried to run, but I couldn't move, frozen in place as it came closer and closer. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The image of that reflection burned into my mind. The dream had felt so real, too real. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. The house was silent, but the oppressive feeling lingered in the air. I had to get rid of the mirror for good. The next morning, I called a junk removal service and arranged for them to pick it up. I didn't care what they did with it, I just wanted it out of my house. I didn't tell them what had happened, of course. I couldn't even explain it to myself. The truck came later that afternoon, and I watched as they loaded the mirror into the back. I felt a strange mixture of relief and fear as it disappeared from view, but the house felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. That night, for the first time in days, I slept soundly. But the peace didn't last long. A week later, I came home from work to find the attic door ajar. My heart sank. I hadn't been up there since I got rid of the mirror, and I knew I had closed the door. I slowly climbed the stairs, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. The attic was dark, and the familiar musty smell filled the air. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. And then I saw it. The mirror. It was back, sitting in the corner where I had found it, the sheet draped over it as if it had never been moved. I stared in disbelief, my mind racing. How could it be here? I had gotten rid of it. I had watched them take it away. My hands shook as I approached the mirror, dread filling my chest. I pulled the sheet off, and there it was, the same ornate frame, the same cloudy glass. But something was different this time. There was no reflection. The mirror was empty. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. My reflection was gone. The mirror was just a blank, empty pane of glass. I turned to leave, but as I reached the attic door, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from behind me. I froze, too terrified to turn around. The air in the attic grew colder, and the soft sound of footsteps drew closer. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could feel the presence behind me, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had, and turned around. The mirror was no longer empty. My reflection was back, standing in the glass, smiling. But I wasn't smiling. Story 14. The phone that never rang. When I moved into the old apartment, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was a quiet building, tucked away at the end of a narrow street, far from the city's hustle and bustle. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were polite but distant, and everything about the place felt comfortable, at least at first. The apartment came fully furnished, which was part of its appeal. The furniture was old but sturdy, the kind you don't mind living with because it feels like it's been broken in over time. One of the more curious pieces was the old rotary phone sitting on the small table in the hallway. It was a classic black model, the kind you'd see in movies from the 1950s, complete with a heavy receiver and a long coiled cord. It was completely outdated, of course, who even used landlines anymore? But there it was, sitting there like it belonged, as much a part of the apartment as the worn armchair by the window or the faded rug in the living room. The phone didn't work. I found that out on the first day when I tried to pick it up out of curiosity. There was no dial tone, no connection. It was just a relic of the past, left behind for decoration. It didn't bother me I had my cell phone, and I wasn't planning on using the rotary phone anyway. But the phone soon became the focal point of the apartment in ways I never expected. A few weeks after moving in, I began to notice strange things about the phone. It wasn't just the way it looked, sitting there in the hallway, gathering dust. It was the feeling I got every time I walked past it, a kind of presence, like the phone was watching me. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling only grew stronger. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt the weight of the phone, like it was waiting for something, for me. And then, one night, it rang. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when the shrill sound of the rotary phone echoed through the apartment. The sound startled me so much that I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the phone, confused and a little shaken. It wasn't connected to anything. How could it be ringing? The ringing continued, persistent and sharp, cutting through the silence of the apartment. I slowly stood up, my feet moving on their own as I approached the phone. The sound felt like it was drilling into my skull, each ring louder than the last. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the receiver, my hand trembling as I lifted it to my ear. "Hello," I asked, my voice shaky. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. Thick, oppressive silence. I waited, listening, my heart racing, but no one answered. "Hello," I said again, louder this time, hoping for some response. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. Breathing. Soft, shallow breathing, barely audible over the crackle of the phone line. My stomach twisted in fear, and I gripped the receiver tighter, my mind racing. Who was on the other end? Why were they calling? Who is this? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. But there was no response. Just more breathing, slow, deliberate, like someone was listening to me, waiting. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, my mind reeling. It wasn't connected. There was no way anyone could have called it, but it had rung, and someone had been on the other end of the line. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind outside made me jump. My thoughts kept drifting back to the phone, to the soft breathing I had heard. Who had been calling me? And how? The next day, I checked the phone again, half expecting it to have been some kind of strange dream or hallucination. But the phone was still there, silent and unmoving, exactly where it had always been. I tried to forget about the call, but the unease lingered. Days passed, and I found myself growing more and more paranoid. Every time I walked past the phone, I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to pick it up again. Then it rang the second time. It was late at night, and I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the city in the distance. But then, out of nowhere, the phone rang. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was sharper this time, more insistent. It echoed down the hallway, filling the apartment with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I didn't want to answer it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave it alone, to let it ring and pretend it wasn't happening, but I couldn't ignore it. The sound was too loud, too demanding. I got out of bed and walked slowly down the hallway, my steps hesitant. The phone rang again and again, each ring more urgent than the last. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver, lifting it to my ear. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, there was only silence. And then the breathing returned. It was louder this time, more deliberate. Whoever was on the other end of the line was listening closely, like they were waiting for something. My pulse quickened, and I struggled to find my voice. "Who are you?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. The breathing continued, slow and rhythmic. I could almost feel the presence of the caller, as if they were standing right next to me, just out of sight. And then they spoke. "Why did you move in?" The voice was low, a raspy whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded distant, like it was coming from far away, but the words were clear. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just more breathing. And then the line went dead. I dropped the receiver, stumbling back from the phone, my heart racing. I stood there, frozen in fear, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Someone had spoken to me. Someone who knew I had moved into the apartment. But how? The phone wasn't connected. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in bed, staring at the door to the hallway, half expecting the phone to ring again. But it didn't. The next morning, I tried to rationalize the call. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had found a way to tap into the old phone line and was messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Over the next few days, the phone rang several more times. Each time I ignored it, letting it ring and ring until the sound eventually stopped. But the calls were always the same silence, followed by that slow, deliberate breathing. And then, one night, the call stopped altogether. At first, I felt relieved. The silence was a welcome change after days of constant ringing, but that relief quickly turned to dread. I realized that the absence of the calls didn't feel right. It was as if something was waiting, watching, lurking in the background. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of something moving in the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to listen. It was faint at first, just a soft, rustling sound, like someone shifting their weight. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway where the phone sat. I held my breath, fear paralyzing me as the footsteps drew closer. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and oppressive. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. The soft sound of breathing just outside my door. Story 15. The doll in the basement. The first time I saw the doll, it was tucked away in the farthest corner of the basement, sitting on an old, dusty shelf. It was easy to miss. I had spent the better part of the day moving into the new house, hauling boxes up and down stairs, trying to get things settled. By the time I got around to exploring the basement, I was exhausted, eager to call it a night. The basement itself was like something out of a horror movie, cold, damp, with stone walls and a single bare light bulb that flickered ominously when I pulled the chain. The air smelled of mildew, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. I wasn't expecting to find anything strange down there, just a few leftover boxes from the previous owners, old furniture, that sort of thing. But there, sitting all alone on the shelf, was a doll. It was small porcelain, with faded pink cheeks and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. Its clothes were tattered and yellowed with age, but there was something about it that made me stop and stare. It wasn't just any doll, it was eerily lifelike. For a moment, I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I quickly brushed it off. It was just a doll, after all. Probably something left behind by the last family who lived in the house. I didn't think much of it at the time. I turned off the light, left the basement, and went about unpacking the rest of my things. But that night, I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable, my mind wandering back to the basement. I couldn't shake the image of the doll from my thoughts, its cold, glassy eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, pale and still, watching. By the next morning, I had almost convinced myself that it was just my imagination. It was a stressful time moving into a new house, adjusting to a new place. Of course, my mind would play tricks on me. But as the day wore on, I felt a strange sense of unease creeping back. I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. Eventually, I decided to go back down to the basement just to make sure everything was fine. Maybe moving the doll would help me shake the weird feeling I had. I wasn't normally superstitious, but something about that doll bothered me more than it should have. I grabbed a box from the kitchen and made my way down to the basement, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air down there felt colder than before, and the flickering light seemed dimmer, casting long shadows across the room. The doll was still there, sitting in its spot, exactly where I had left it. But something was different this time. The doll's head had tilted slightly to the side, just enough to make it look like it was watching me more intently than before. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't touched the doll the day before, and I was certain it hadn't been in that position when I first saw it. I approached the shelf slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I picked up the doll, its porcelain skin cool to the touch, and placed it inside the box. As I did, I couldn't help but notice how its eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, like they were following my every movement. I brought the box upstairs, planning to throw the doll out with the rest of the junk I didn't need. I placed it near the trash and went about my day, trying to push the unsettling experience to the back of my mind. That night, I slept a little better until I woke up in the middle of the night. It was 3:15 a.m., and the house was silent, save for the soft creaks and groans of the old wooden floorboards. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from downstairs. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought it must be the wind or maybe a tree branch brushing against a window, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was knocking softly on the floor. I forced myself out of bed, grabbing a flashlight from my nightstand as I made my way downstairs. The house was pitch black, and every step I took echoed through the empty rooms. The tapping grew louder as I approached the basement door, a slow, steady rhythm that sent a shiver down my spine. I opened the basement door, the creak of the hinges sending a wave of dread through me. I shone the flashlight down the stairs, half expecting to see someone or something waiting for me in the darkness. But the basement was empty. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight flickering slightly as I reached the bottom. The air was colder than before, and the light bulb above me buzzed softly, casting a dim glow across the room. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the basement, my eyes scanning the shelves and corners for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. The doll. It was sitting on the shelf again, its head tilted slightly, just like before. But I had put it in the box. I had placed it upstairs, ready to throw it out. How could it be back in the basement? My heart raced as I stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. The doll's eyes gleamed in the dim light, and I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking. I turned and ran back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I was determined to get rid of the doll for good. I grabbed the box from upstairs, stuffed the doll inside, and drove to the nearest dump. I tossed the box into a bin, watching as it disappeared among the trash. A wave of relief washed over me as I drove home, hoping I had finally rid myself of whatever strange presence had come with the doll. But that night, the tapping returned. It started just after midnight, the same soft, rhythmic sound coming from the basement. My blood ran cold as I lay in bed, listening. I knew what it was. The doll had somehow come back. I forced myself out of bed, dread curling in my stomach. This time I didn't bother with the flashlight. I went straight to the basement, flinging the door open and storming down the stairs. And there it was. The doll sitting on the shelf exactly where it had been before. Its head was tilted to the side, and its eyes seemed brighter, more alive than they had ever been. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the doll. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had it come back? How was it possible? And then, slowly, the doll's head turned. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The doll's glassy eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt something stir in the room, something dark, something malevolent. The light bulb flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I could feel the air grow colder, could hear the soft sound of the tapping growing louder. echoing all around me. It wasn't just the doll anymore. Something else was in the basement with me. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the house. I don't remember driving away. All I know is that I left that night and never went back. The house still stands, as far as I know, and the doll is still down there, sitting on the shelf, waiting for someone else to find it. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the soft tapping sound, faint but unmistakable, as if it's calling me back. Story 16. The creaking floorboards. It started with the floorboards. I had been living in the house for about 2 months when I first noticed a low, almost imperceptible creak that echoed through the otherwise quiet rooms. At first, I didn't think much of it. The house was old, and old houses make noise. That's just how it is. But the creaking was persistent. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps moving across the floor. It started in the hallway outside my bedroom, and each night it seemed to come a little closer. It wasn't loud, just soft enough that I could almost convince myself I hadn't heard anything at all. Almost. The first few times it happened, I brushed it off. I had always lived in apartments before, and this was my first time living in a standalone house. I figured it was just the house settling, maybe a draft causing the old wooden floors to shift. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sounds were too regular, too intentional, like someone or something was walking through the house at night. I started paying closer attention, lying in bed each night with my ears straining for the faintest sound. The creaking always began around midnight, slow and steady, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. It never seemed to reach my bedroom door. It would stop just short, as if whoever was making the noise didn't want to be seen. One night, after weeks of restless sleep, I decided to investigate. I was tired of feeling on edge, tired of waiting for the footsteps that never seemed to stop. So, armed with nothing but my cell phone flashlight, I forced myself out of bed and into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the thin sliver of moonlight through the window. The air felt heavy, and every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed unnaturally loud. My heart raced as I moved down the hallway, following the path of the footsteps I had been hearing night after night. But the house was empty. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no open windows or doors, just the eerie stillness of an old, empty house. I tried to calm myself, convincing my racing mind that it was all in my head. Maybe I was just imagining things, or maybe it was a trick of the acoustics. But as I made my way back to the bedroom, I heard it again. The creaking. Only this time, it wasn't in the hallway. It was behind me. I spun around, shining the light into the darkened hallway, my heart pounding. The floorboards creaked again, closer now, like someone was standing just out of sight. I stared into the darkness, waiting for something to appear, for someone to step out of the shadows. But no one did. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The creaking stopped, and the house fell silent again. But the feeling of being watched, of someone or something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, stayed with me long after I had locked the bedroom door and crawled back into bed. The next morning, I called a contractor to check the floors. I told him about the noises I'd been hearing, hoping he'd find something loose floorboards, maybe, or old pipes rattling beneath the house. But after a thorough inspection, he found nothing. The floors were in perfect condition. It's probably just the house settling, he said with a shrug. Old houses do that sometimes. I wanted to believe him. I really did, but the creaking hadn't stopped. It was getting worse. That night, the creaking started earlier. This time, it wasn't just in the hallway. I could hear it all over the house, the sound of footsteps moving through the rooms, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking a circuit around the place. The floorboards groaned under the weight of invisible feet, each creak louder than the last. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. The footsteps were everywhere now, moving from room to room, like someone was pacing back and forth, exploring the house. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the creaking stopped. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to return, but the house remained silent. For a few moments, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had been causing the noise had finally stopped. And then I heard it. A single creak, louder than before, just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was standing just outside, waiting. I stared at the door, too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. Was someone in the house? Had someone broken in? But there had been no sign of forced entry, no windows or doors left open. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed 911. The operator answered, her voice calm and professional, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. I explained the situation as best I could, my voice shaky, my eyes fixed on the door. She assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, moving back down the hallway. I could hear it getting fainter, like whoever or whatever was in the house was retreating, but I knew better. I knew it wasn't leaving. It was waiting. And the police arrived about 15 minutes later. They checked the house from top to bottom, every room, every closet, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder. No sign that anyone had been there at all. The floorboards creaked under their boots as they walked through the house. But to them, it was just an old house doing what old houses do. But I knew better. I knew the creaking wasn't normal. It was something else. The officers left after assuring me that the house was safe, but I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards kept me awake, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. Over the next few days, the noises grew louder, more frequent. The creaking wasn't just at night anymore. I heard it during the day, 2 footsteps moving through the house, always when I was alone. I could feel the floor shift beneath my feet, like something was walking just behind me, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the noises continued, relentless, until I couldn't stand it anymore. One night, I decided to set up a camera. If there was someone or something in the house, I was going to catch it. I placed the camera in the hallway, facing the spot where I always heard the creaking, and left it running overnight. The next morning, I checked the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. The camera showed the empty hallway, still and quiet. But then, just after midnight, the creaking started. I watched as the floorboards shifted slightly, the wood bending under the weight of invisible footsteps, but there was no one there. The hallway remained empty, but the creaking continued, moving slowly down the hall. And then, at 3:15 a.m., the camera caught something else. A shadow. It appeared out of nowhere, flickering at the edge of the frame. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A dark, shapeless figure moving down the hallway, its form barely visible in the dim light. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I rewound the footage, watching the shadow appear and disappear over and over again. It didn't make sense. There was nothing in the house. No one had been there. But the shadow was real. And so were the footsteps. I packed my things that day and left the house. I didn't want to stay there another night, not with whatever was lurking in the hallway. The landlord didn't ask any questions when I told him I was leaving. I think he knew. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the creaking of floorboards, the slow, deliberate footsteps of something that doesn't want to be seen. Story 17. The room with no windows. I should have known something was wrong with the house the moment I saw the room. It was tucked away at the back of the first floor, a small square space with no windows. The previous owner had mentioned it briefly during the tour, calling it just an extra storage room, but there was something about it that made me uneasy from the start. The house itself was perfect, or so I had thought. It was old, with high ceilings, large windows, and a spacious layout that seemed ideal for me. The price had been almost too good to be true, and the location was exactly what I was looking for. But that room, there was something off about it. It wasn't just the lack of windows, it was the way the room felt when I stepped inside. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed closer than they should have been, like the room was pressing in on me. The moment I crossed the threshold, a chill ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But I brushed it off. Every old house has its quirks, right? Maybe the room was just poorly ventilated, or maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a room. What could be so strange about it? I moved in a few days later, and for the first week, everything seemed fine. I didn't spend much time in the back of the house, and I had no real reason to go into the room with no windows. It was empty, unused, and I figured I'd eventually turn it into storage or maybe an office, but as the days passed, I found myself avoiding it more and more. There was something about that room. I couldn't explain it, but every time I walked past the door, I felt a sense of dread, like something inside was watching me, waiting. I started closing the door whenever I walked by, telling myself it was just to keep the house looking tidy. But the truth was, I didn't want to see inside. And then, one night, I heard the noise. It was around midnight, and I was lying in bed, half asleep, when a soft thudding sound echoed through the house. I sat up, straining to listen. It was faint, almost like the sound of someone knocking on a door but inside the house. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and slowly made my way down the hall. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the walls. I followed the sound to the back of the house, and that's when I realized where it was coming from. The room with no windows. The thudding grew louder as I approached the door, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was knocking from the inside. My pulse quickened as I reached for the handle, hesitating for a moment before slowly pushing the door open. The room was empty. I stood there in the doorway, staring into the small, windowless space, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The thudding had stopped the moment I opened the door, and the room was silent, still. But something wasn't right. The air felt colder than before, and the sense of unease that had been lingering at the back of my mind now surged to the forefront. I could feel that something was wrong with that room. It was like the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with a strange, oppressive energy. I backed away, closing the door behind me, and returned to bed. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and overthinking things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was in that room. Over the next few days, the noise became more frequent, always at night, always around midnight. The same soft thudding sound like someone or something was trapped inside, knocking to get out. Each time I would go to the door, open it, and find nothing. I tried to ignore it, but the fear gnawed at me. I started hearing whispers, faint and barely audible, coming from the room. Sometimes I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting in the darkness, but whenever I looked, the room was empty. I began avoiding that part of the house altogether, closing the door and locking it whenever I could. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the whole house was being shaken by the relentless knocking. One night, after weeks of restless sleep, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to find out what was going on in that room. So I called a contractor, hoping to find some logical explanation. Maybe there was something wrong with the structure, or maybe there were animals trapped in the walls. Anything would be better than what my imagination had conjured up. The contractor arrived the next morning, a gruff man in his 50s who didn't seem the type to scare easily. I explained the situation as best I could, and he nodded, saying he'd take a look. I watched as he opened the door to the room and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the dim space. He checked the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, tapping and prodding, but after about 20 minutes, he emerged from the room looking puzzled. "There's nothing wrong with it," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. "No leaks, no cracks, no signs of anything unusual. It's just an empty room." I wanted to believe him, but the fear still lingered. I thanked him and paid for the inspection, but as soon as he left, the dread crept back. The room was quiet now, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. That night, the thudding returned louder than ever. It started around midnight, just like before, but this time it wasn't a soft knock. It was a heavy, deliberate pounding, like someone was slamming their fists against the walls. The entire house seemed to tremble with the force of it, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath my feet. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. The pounding grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside that room was desperate to get out. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the hall, every step filled with dread. The noise was deafening now, echoing through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grasped the handle. And then, as I turned the knob, the pounding stopped. The silence was sudden, almost suffocating. I stood there, frozen, my hand still on the door, too afraid to open it. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing against me, as if it was waiting for me to make a move. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the faint beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the thick shadows. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the empty space. The walls were bare, the floor untouched, but the sense of wrongness was overwhelming. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, where the light barely reached, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light, maybe. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person hunched over, their back to me, unmoving. My heart stopped. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It just sat there, silent and still. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this person? How had they gotten into the room? And why hadn't I seen them before? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure remained motionless, as if it hadn't noticed me at all. And then, slowly, it began to turn. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The figure turned its head, just enough for me to see the pale outline of its face, its hollow, empty eyes staring back at me. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the house. I don't remember getting into my car or driving away. All I know is that I left that night and never went back. The house is still there, empty, waiting for someone else to find that room with no windows. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the relentless pounding, the faint whispers, and the figure sitting in the dark, waiting. Story 18. The Locked Journal. I found the journal on a rainy afternoon while sorting through a box of old family belongings. My grandmother had passed away several months earlier, and her house had been left to me. The house was filled with decades of memories, photographs, knickknacks, and personal items she had collected over the years. But the journal stood out immediately. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn from years of use, and a small brass lock held it shut. There was no key. The pages inside had yellowed with age, and the edges were frayed. It didn't have a title, just the initials E.G. embossed on the front. I didn't recognize the initials. My grandmother's name was Clara, and there was no one in the family with those initials, at least not that I knew of. Curious, I turned the journal over in my hands, trying to figure out who it belonged to. My mind wandered to the stories my grandmother used to tell, about relatives' long-gone names that had faded from memory. Could this journal belong to one of them? I set it aside for the time being, figuring I'd come back to it later. There were still dozens of boxes to sort through, and I didn't want to get distracted. But as the days passed, I found myself thinking more and more about that journal. What was written inside? Why had it been locked? And most importantly, why didn't anyone in the family know about it? I tried to ignore it, telling myself it wasn't important, but the thought nagged at me, growing stronger each day. Finally, unable to resist any longer, I decided to open it. The lock was old and delicate, so it wasn't difficult to break. With a small screwdriver, I managed to pry it open, and the journal fell easily into my hands. My fingers trembled as I flipped to the first page, eager to uncover whatever secrets were hidden inside. The handwriting was elegant but small, written in black ink that had faded slightly over time. I leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. The first entry was dated March 3, 1924, nearly a century ago. But what caught my attention wasn't the date, it was the tone of the writing. The author, whoever they were, sounded scared. _ I can't sleep. The dreams won't stop. Every night I see the same thing, the same figure standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I've tried locking the doors, closing the curtains, but nothing helps. It's always there. Always watching _ My skin prickled as I read the words. What had I stumbled upon? Was this a diary of someone in my family? But no one had ever mentioned anything like this before. The journal didn't read like a simple diary, it felt like a confession. A warning? I turned to the next entry, dated 2 days later. The figure is getting closer. Last night, it wasn't just standing at the foot of the bed. It was in the room with me, hovering in the shadows. I could feel its presence. Cold. Suffocating. I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing. But when I turned on the light, it was gone. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of person would write something like this? The more I read, the more unsettling it became. The author described increasingly vivid nightmares, each one more disturbing than the last. They wrote about seeing things in the dark, shadows that moved on their own, and whispers that followed them wherever they went. I can't escape it. No matter where I go, it's always there, waiting for me, watching me. The others don't believe me. They say it's just my imagination, but I know the truth. It's real. I can feel it. I set the journal down, my heart pounding. I didn't know whether to keep reading or to stop. The entries were filled with a growing sense of dread, like the author was spiraling into some kind of madness. But the more I read, the more I felt like I needed to know what had happened to them. I picked up the journal again, flipping ahead to a later entry. The writing had grown shakier, more frantic. I've locked the door, but it won't stay out. I hear it at night scratching at the walls, whispering my name. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm not safe here. No one is . At that point, I felt a strange compulsion to look around the room, as if I expected to see someone or something watching me. The house was quiet, but it felt different now, like the air had grown colder, heavier. I could feel my own heartbeat louder than before, like it was keeping pace with the dread building inside me. I flipped to the final entry, dated May 12, 1924. It was brief, only a few lines scrawled across the page. I know what it wants now. I've seen its face. It's waiting for me in the dark, but I won't give in. Not yet. I have to stop it before it finds someone else. I have to . The writing ended abruptly, a jagged line trailing off the page, as if the author had been interrupted. The rest of the journal was blank. I sat there, staring at the last page, my mind racing. The author had clearly been terrified. But of what? There was no explanation, no resolution, just an overwhelming sense of fear that lingered even after I closed the journal. I should have stopped there. I should have put the journal away and forgotten about it. But something inside me wouldn't let go. I needed to know more. What had happened to the person who wrote it? Had they gone mad? Or had they really been haunted by something that was still out there? I spent the next few days searching for answers. I combed through family records, old photos, anything that might give me a clue about who E.G. was, but I found nothing. It was as if the author had never existed. No one in the family had ever mentioned anyone with those initials, and the house itself had no records of previous owners who matched. As the days went on, strange things started happening in the house. It began with small noises, creaks in the floorboards, faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the result of reading too much into the journal, but the noises grew louder, more frequent. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the walls. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get in. I turned on the light, but the noise didn't stop. It seemed to move around the room, circling me, always just out of sight. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but I could hear it. My name. Aim. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The house was silent again, but I could feel that something was there, watching me, just like the author had written. I glanced at the journal, now sitting on the nightstand, and a terrible thought crossed my mind. Had I brought this on myself by opening it? I didn't sleep that night. The scratching continued, growing louder and more frantic as the hours passed. The whispers returned, soft and menacing, calling my name over and over. I tried to ignore it, but the fear was too strong. The next morning, I packed up the journal and left the house. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. Whatever had haunted the author of the journal was now haunting me. I don't know what became of E.G. But I know this. Some things are better left locked away. Story 19. The Haunted Painting. I first noticed the painting during a visit to a local antique shop. It was an unremarkable place, tucked away on a quiet street, filled with dusty old furniture and trinkets from decades past. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just browsing to kill time. But then I saw an old oil painting propped up against the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. It wasn't the most beautiful painting I had ever seen, but there was something about it that caught my eye. The image was simple, a portrait of a woman standing in a dark forest, her face half hidden in shadow. She wore a long, flowing dress, her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes seemed to follow me wherever I moved. I found myself drawn to the painting, captivated by the way the artist had captured the woman's expression. She looked sad, almost like she was carrying some kind of secret. The more I stared at it, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of melancholy wash over me, like the woman in the painting was pleading for help. The shopkeeper must have noticed me staring because he came over and stood beside me. Interested in that one, he asked, his voice gruff. "It's been here a while. Can't seem to sell it." How much, I asked, without really thinking. The shopkeeper hesitated, glancing at the painting as if he were weighing his answer. "I'll give it to you for a bargain, $50. Fucks. $50. For an antique painting like this, it felt like a steal. Without hesitation, I agreed, and within the hour I was driving home with the painting propped up in the back seat. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a painting. After all, something to fill the blank space on my living room wall. But as soon as I hung it up, things started to feel different. At first it was subtle. The air in the room seemed colder whenever I was near the painting, like there was a draft coming from somewhere, even though all the windows were shut. The house, which had always felt warm and cozy, now seemed darker, more oppressive. And then there was the woman in the painting. No matter where I stood, her eyes followed me. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it was more than just an optical illusion. I could feel her gaze, heavy and unblinking, tracking my every move. Whether I was in the kitchen, the hallway, or sitting on the couch, I always felt her watching me. It was as though the woman in the painting wasn't just an image on canvas, she was something else, something alive. One night, as I was lying in bed, I thought I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. I sat up, straining to listen, but the noise faded, leaving only silence. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But then, the next night, it happened again. This time, the whispering was clearer, more distinct. It was coming from the living room, where the painting hung on the wall. I froze, my heart racing as I listened. The voice was soft, almost melodic, like someone was murmuring just out of earshot. I got out of bed and crept toward the living room, my pulse quickening with every step. As I approached, the whispering grew louder, and I could finally make out the words. "Help me." I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was coming from the painting. I knew it. My eyes darted to the portrait hanging on the wall, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows behind the woman's figure. But when I blinked, the image was still. Shaken, I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The sound of her voice, that soft plea for help, echoed in my mind, keeping me awake until the early hours of the morning. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Over the next few days, the whispering continued. Every night, just after midnight, I would hear the same voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me," she would say, over and over again, like a broken record. It was as if the woman in the painting was trapped, calling out to me for rescue. The more I heard it, the more I became convinced that the painting was haunted. I started avoiding the living room altogether, spending most of my time in the other parts of the house. But no matter where I went, I could feel her presence, lingering in the back of my mind, watching, waiting. I did some research on the painting, hoping to find out more about its origins, but there was nothing, no record of the artist, no history of the portrait. It was as though the painting had appeared out of nowhere. Even the shopkeeper, when I called him back, didn't have any useful information. It's been sitting in the shop for years, he said. No one knows where it came from. The following week, things escalated. I woke up one night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound was too real soft, deliberate footsteps moving toward my bedroom. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen with fear, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. For a long moment, everything was silent. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, but then slowly the door creaked open, just enough for me to see into the hallway. There was no one there. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling, and grabbed the nearest object for protection, a heavy lamp from the nightstand. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart racing, and shone the beam of my phone's flashlight into the darkness. The living room was empty. The painting hung on the wall, just as it always had, but something was different. The woman in the painting was no longer standing in the forest. She had moved. Her face was still half in shadow, but now she was closer. Her body angled slightly as though she had taken a step toward me. Her expression had changed to her eyes wider, more desperate, and her lips parted as if she were about to speak. A wave of terror washed over me. I backed away from the painting, my mind spinning. This wasn't possible. How could the painting have changed? How could she have moved? I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the painting, waiting for something else to happen. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. "Help me," the voice repeated over and over. "Please, help me." I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get rid of the painting. The next morning, I took it down from the wall and drove it back to the antique shop. The shopkeeper seemed surprised to see me, but when I explained what had been happening, his expression darkened. "You're not the first," he said quietly, "taking the painting from me. That painting's been in and out of here for years. Every time someone buys it, they bring it back. They say the same thing: voices, movement, nightmares." I stared at him, shocked. "Why didn't you tell me?" He shrugged, setting the painting down behind the counter. "No one believes in that kind of stuff until it happens to them." I left the shop without another word, relieved to be rid of the painting, but the feeling of being watched never really went away. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and feel her presence, like she's still waiting for me to come back. And sometimes just before I fall asleep, I hear it. A whisper. Story 20. The Silent Passenger. I always preferred driving late at night. The roads were empty, and the quiet stretch of highway between my town and the city was peaceful in a way that helped me clear my mind. The hum of the car engine, the dark sky lit by a faint glow of stars, the occasional street lamp casting fleeting shadows, there was something calming about it. But after that night, I stopped driving alone after dark. It was a few months ago, sometime around midnight, when I was driving back home after visiting a friend. The highway was deserted, just me and my headlights cutting through the blackness. I had driven this route countless times before, so I wasn't paying much attention, just thinking about getting home, climbing into bed, and getting some much-needed rest. That's when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light of my headlights. At first, I thought I was imagining it. There was no reason for anyone to be out there in the middle of the night, on a stretch of highway with no houses or exits for miles. But as I got closer, I realized she was real. A woman standing by the edge of the road, her arm raised in a weak attempt to flag me down. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, with long, dark hair that hung limply around her face. Her clothes were disheveled, a simple dress that looked too thin for the chilly night air. But what struck me most was her expression. She looked terrified, her wide eyes darting around as if she were being chased. I pulled over, rolling down the window. "Do you need help?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She stepped closer to the car, her movements hesitant, almost reluctant. Something about her made me uneasy, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, closing the door softly behind her. As soon as she was inside, The temperature seemed to drop. I shivered, adjusting the heat, but the cold remained, seeping into my skin. I glanced over at her, trying to make conversation to break the awkward silence. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here this late?" She didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wide and unblinking. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. "You're lucky I came by," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed my nerves. "There's not much traffic on this road at night." Again, no response. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the car engine and the faint rush of wind outside. I glanced over at her again, my heart pounding a little faster now. She was still staring straight ahead, her face pale in the dim light, her expression blank. I tried again. "Where are you heading? I can drop you off somewhere." This time, she turned to look at me. Her eyes. There was something wrong with her eyes. They were too wide, too dark, as if they held something terrible inside them. I felt a chill run down my spine as her gaze met mine, and for a moment I was too stunned to speak. Then she whispered, her voice barely audible, "He's coming." I blinked, confused. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the road, her hands gripping the edge of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The temperature in the car seemed to drop even further, and I felt the air around us grow thick with tension. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to stop the car, to tell her to get out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She looked so scared, so fragile, like she was on the verge of breaking. And then I saw the headlights. They appeared in my rearview mirror, bright and blinding, coming up fast behind us. My heart leaped into my throat as the car behind me grew closer, speeding down the highway with no signs of slowing down. I hit the gas, trying to put some distance between us, but the headlights stayed close, following us at breakneck speed. My pulse raced as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The car behind us was too close, dangerously close. "He's here," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. I glanced at her, panic rising in my chest. "Who's here? What's going on?" But she didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her body tense, her eyes wide with fear. The car behind us honked, the sound blaring through the night, and I swerved, trying to keep control as it veered closer. "Hold on," I shouted, my heart pounding. The car behind us sped up, its headlights flashing in my rearview mirror, blinding me. It was so close now that I could hear the engine roaring, the sound almost deafening. I pressed down on the gas, desperate to outrun it, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed right on our tail. Suddenly, the woman screamed. Her voice was high-pitched, filled with terror, and it pierced the air like a knife. I glanced at her, and my blood ran cold. She was staring at the rearview mirror, her face twisted in horror, her hands clutching the seat. I looked in the mirror. There was no car. The road behind us was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the highway. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, my mind racing. How could that be? The car had been right behind us, chasing us, blinding us with its headlights. But now there was nothing. No car, no headlights. Just the empty stretch of road disappearing into the night. I turned to the woman, my voice shaking. What? What just happened? But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. I stared at the seat, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. She had been right there, sitting beside me, screaming. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. The car behind us, the woman's terrified whispers, the way she had just vanished. Finally, I started the car again, driving home in a daze. The road was still empty, the night eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me, waiting. When I got home, I researched everything I could about that stretch of highway. I didn't know what I was looking for, an explanation, maybe, or some kind of closure, and that's when I found it. Years ago, there had been an accident on that same road. A young woman had been killed, hit by a car while she was trying to flag someone down for help. The driver had fled the scene, leaving her to die on the side of the road. They never caught him. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if the woman was real, if she was some kind of ghost, or if it was all just a horrible, vivid hallucination. But one thing is certain, I've never driven that road again. And I've never driven alone at night since.